Below this body of water lies the ghost town referred to as Whiskeytown. It became a ghost town as of 1963. The town was a thriving community during the gold rush era. Whiskeytown was a couple miles west of Shasta in Northern California, and it was adjacent to French Gulch. Its water supplies came from the Trinity River and Clear Creek, but currently this town is submerged below 264 feet of lake water, known as Whiskeytown Lake. Let's dive into the history of the town and some of the locals who live there. Whiskeytown was located 8 miles west of Redding, California, located in Shasta County. It was a bustling town with some rowdy characters. It was Shasta County's first gold mining town during the gold rush of 1849. There are two stories of how the town got its name. The first story goes something like this. A local miner named Billy Peterson was hauling supplies back to his mining claim when his mule pack broke loose. A barrel of whiskey tumbled down the hillside. When the barrel came into contact with the rocks, it broke open, spilling its contents into the creek. My guess is Billy told all the locals of his misfortune. It soon became known as Whiskey Creek, and the settlement became known as Whiskey Creek Diggings. A second story was based in fact that the miners were known to cut loose and drink a lot, whiskey being their drink of choice. It was said that the miners could drink a barrel of whiskey a day. During these times, around 1,000 folks lived in the community. Several saloons and a general store were known to sell several types of whiskey. The community consisted of 90% males, so in the evenings and during bad weather and on Sundays, when the men weren't in mines, their favorite pastime involved visiting the saloons, drinking whiskey, washing their clothes, doing their chores, and stocking up on supplies for the next week. Whiskeytown remained a small hub and a layover town for travelers passing through. Its location was adjacent to a main traveling route. Whiskeytown had one school, one post office, several saloons, a general store, and stables. Prior to the miners and homesteaders living in the area, the Windtube tribe had lived there for centuries. Thousands and thousands of Europeans and Eastern Americans came for the gold in the 1850s to California and to Nevada. Whiskeytown was formalized in 1852. The first woman arrived in town in 1852, and the post office was opened in 1856. Now, the federal government did not allow the Whiskeytown name to be attached to the location. It was considered inappropriate, so they referred to the town as Stella, Blair, Shillings, as well as many other names. By 1870, much of the gold had been extracted. Many folks moved on, just like so many other gold rush towns. The town scaled back but managed to stay alive. During the Great Depression in the 1930s, while millions of folks were unemployed in America, the population of the times turned to ranching and farming instead of mining for gold. The Women's League campaigned to keep their name as Whiskeytown. The ladies won the fight, and it was official. The name was permanently adopted in 1952. It's been said that the surrounding streams and gulches brought in $25 million in gold. The Redding, California local newspaper, the Record Searchlight, reports that the miners averaged $50 in gold per day, valued at $2,039.41 in 2024. In 1851, a 56-ounce gold nugget was found. I think it's safe to say the miners at the time were prospering. Disproportionate amounts of rainfall affected the irrigation of farms in the Central Valley. So a federal water project decided to provide irrigation water to the area. The government claimed the water in Northern California. Shasta Dam was built in the 1940s, so the plan to do the same for the Trinity River sprang up. This would destroy Whiskeytown, but providing water to the Sacramento River became priority. So construction around the dam site began in August of 1960 by clearing the land. so the last remaining residents of Whiskeytown were paid for their land. Some of the homes and businesses were relocated to Shasta, which is now Old Shasta. The post office and cemetery, as well as the general store, were among the relocations. Excavations for the spillway and outlet tunnels began in October of 1960, and by the end of 1961, over half of the dam embankment was finished. The dam was complete February 7, 1963, and the reservoir began filling. More than 10,000 people came out for the dedication by President John F. Kennedy on September 28, 1963. The lake was named after the gold rush town, which was now submerged by water. It was 264 feet deep, which is roughly 20 stories high. Scuba divers are known to dive the lake to explore the remains of the old town. Allegedly, a steam engine is among the remains. Let me tell you about some of the folks who lived around Whiskeytown. Charles Camden was one of the most successful businessmen of the 19th century in Northern California. He was the seventh son of Joseph and Anne Camden. He was born in England January 29, 1817. He sailed west to New York at the age of 17. He stayed in New York for several years before heading to Chile and Peru, where he worked as an engineer. He came down with gold fever in 1849, so he sailed up the coast to Northern California and resided in San Francisco for a while. In the spring of 1850, Charles Camden met Levi Tower and they became friends and partners. They sailed north in search of the Trinity River. Once they arrived, they made their way over the Trinity or Klamath Mountains until they reached Clear Creek. Camden built a small cabin, a sawmill, water ditches, and put up a mining operation on the north end of Whiskeytown. He later built toll roads and bridges. Eventually, he built a much larger home and called it the Camden House. Today, this home remains a historical structure. Now, Levi Tower provided food and shelter to miners in the area. He invested his profits into creating a 21-room hotel, a garden, and an orchard named the Tower House Luxury Hotel. In the 1850s, Camden took out $80,000 in gold from his mining operation in Whiskeytown and the Clear Creek area. Estimated value is worth $1 million today. He constructed waterways, ditches, and miniature canals that provided his home, his mining operation, and his farm with water. Folks downstream also paid him for water use. His waterway was known as the Crystal Creek Water Ditch. Levi Tower was born in Rhode Island on September 10, 1820. He arrived in Northern California in 1849 by sailing around South America's Cape Horn. Levi purchased land and he created the Tower House Hotel. To increase his business, he formalized a road leading from the town of Shasta to his hotel. He planted a fruit orchard to provide fresh fruit to the folks in town and the hotel guests. He purchased additional hotels in Shasta and in Redding and became a Shasta County politician. Levi had a sister named Philena. She still lived back in Rhode Island. Levi asked her to move out to California and help him run his hotel. So in 1852, Philena courageously crossed the frontier to come to California, when only 10% of the population in California were women. Well, Charles and Philena instantly took a liking to each other, and Levi met Mary Shuffleton. So later that year, Levi and Charles had the first double wedding ceremony in Shasta County's history. Charles married Levi's sister Philena, and Levi married Mary Shuffleton. For a time, these two men had so much in common, but their lives took completely different routes. A short time into their marriage, Levi and Mary divorced. They had the first divorce in Shasta County. Mary remarried shortly after their divorce. Levi's luck was running out. In the mid-1850s, his hotels in Redding and Shasta burned down, and Levi struggled to stay afloat financially. Levi was forced to sell the Tower House Hotel. and by the late 1850s, Camden bought Levi's orchard property and leased it back to him. Unlike his friend, Camden was a success in finance and love. He purchased and improved Levi Tower's toll road from the town of Shasta. He increased the toll fees, and he made a substantial amount from the tolls because the roadway was very busy. Camden's wife Philena was born September 27, 1822. After they were married, she had 3 children. They were all girls: Ada, Mary, and Grace. As you can imagine, in those days, the wife was in charge of the home. Philena kept a journal while she lived in the Whiskeytown district. In her journal, she makes mention of the weather, her dinner guests, her husband and brother's trips to town or other cities, the recipes she kept for cakes and goods, her husband's businesses and the work he put in, the jewelry he purchased her, and how fond she was of her husband. When Camden came home, he was happy to be home, she said. She mentioned the home they were building, working on the ranch, and the mill. 2 men from Red Bluff who had killed a man, her uncle passing away, her husband's birthday, and the dinner they had, which was roast beef and plum pudding for him. The terrible accident that took place on the Sacramento River, where a steamer named Pearl exploded, killing around 50 people. Mark Silverman, who was stabbed to death by a gambler, and the man was now on trial. She would walk to their mill with their baby and visit Camden while he worked. She loved her children and husband, and she cared for them when they were ill. Philena did the baking and the cooking, but she had servants who helped her with chores around the house. One servant was a 10-year-old native girl who they named Kate Camden. Most likely she was a child from the Wintu tribe. She was a helping hand for Charles and his family. She lived in the home and worked for the Camdens in the home. Kate was born around 1844, but there is no mention of her real name prior to living with the Camdens. No details of her previous life are known. In 1850, the new state of California's Act for the Government and Protection of Indians codified a subordinate status for indigenous people, authorizing Caucasians to arrest Native American adults for vagrancy and obtain Native American children for indenture or apprenticeship, separating children from their families. Thousands of displaced Native children became domestic servants and farm hands. This girl, Kate Camden, became one of the many. Kate was believed to have joined the Camden household in 1854 when the Camdens' first daughter, Ada, was born. Kate became a nanny to Ada, as well as performing household chores. Charles wrote to his niece that he was teaching the 10-year-old Kate how to read English and write. This was unusual at those times. In the spring of 1859, the Camdens took a formal trip to England, where Kate went with them. For decades, the Camden household had indigenous and Chinese servants working for them. There is no official record that Kate was indentured, but during these times it was very common to have an indentured girl servant working in the home. Most likely he believed he was doing right by her by civilizing her. In 1865, Levi Tower died at the age of 45 from typhoid fever. His tombstone and final resting place is located within the Tower House Historical District. Charles took over the land and turned it into a successful farming operation of his own. He called his farm the Home Ranch. In 1870, the family spent winters in Oakland, and their 3 daughters received a formal education, but they would return to the Camden house every summer for decades. Charles remained fairly healthy until just before his death, when he died at the age of 95 in 1912. Philena died before Charles. They are buried side by side in the Millionaires Row section in a cemetery in Oakland. It appears that Kate stayed behind in Shasta County, working in other homes. By 1870, Kate lived and worked for the Coleman family in Shasta County. The census showed that Kate had attended school and could read and write. Kate died young in 1871. Her grave is located within the Tower House Historic District, and her headstone includes the words, "Poor Katie Rest." Someone paid to honor her with the headstone, because in those days a wooden marker or an unmarked grave was common for a poor person. I have one more story about a man named John William Harrison. John was known as John William Harrison of Grizzly Gulch. He was born in Wilkes County, North Carolina in 1833. John was the youngest of 3 sons. He also had a younger sister, born to Bentley and Elizabeth Harrison. Bentley was a farmer. John was brought up as a devout Baptist who believed in hard work and honest work. The Harrison family lived for generations prior to the American Revolution in North Carolina. In the 1840s, there was talk of gold in Georgia, so Bentley moved his family there and left the 2 oldest boys to tend the farm. The Harrison family was mentioned in the 1850 census. This gave John a good education in mining for gold. John heard of the gold rush in California and opted to move. John headed for California that same year. John made the trek by land, but he had his personal belongings shipped around the Horn. Once he reached San Francisco, he had his belongings shipped to Sacramento, and he headed out for gold. Working with his father on the farm and panning for gold gave John an advantage over novice miners. He desired less crowded gold fields and heard of the rich northern digging taking place along Clear Creek in Shasta County. He gradually moved up the Sacramento River, and he was registered in the federal census in 1860 in the Whiskeytown mining district of Shasta County. He registered his mailing address as the Tower House Hotel on Clear Creek, the one Levi Tower owned. He had arrived in a place where mining could take precedence over farming, where his hard work could pay off. He had reached his promised land. He could finally make his home, the home that he desired. John managed to survive in a town not known for human longevity. The drinking, the fighting, the deaths, they were all part of the life he chose in Whiskeytown. But there were good people too, ones who became his friends and his neighbors. While John was making a life for himself in Whiskeytown, his brothers had passed away. His brother Franklin had died from typhoid fever in the war, June 28, 1862. His brother Alfred was killed April 17, 1863, from wounds during battle. John had wrote his father and said that he had found gold in California and that he was going to come home, but he never went back. John fell in with a group of men who he became friends with and business partners. John and this group of men built a turnpike for Grizzly Gulch to the Tower Hotel in January of 1862. I'm sure he worked side by side with Camden and/or Levi. The men's names were Jasper Smith from Illinois, Keen Mahoney, who was Irish, Philip Baker, who was Prussian, S.W. Durant from Tennessee, R.B. Emery from Maine, and there was a David Maxim and a William Walton. Most of these men were in their 20s and 30s, except for Baker. He was 55. Men came from all over the world to strike it rich. John had claims in Grizzly Gulch, North Fork of French Gulch, and the west of French Gulch. All his claims were very prosperous. John did not quit when others pulled out in 1878. He was still pulling gold and succeeding at it. John took up with other enterprises as well. In 1880, he became a hotel keeper. John purchased the Madam Brown House in Grizzly Gulch. He was getting older and manual labor was less appealing to him, so working as a hotel keeper made more sense. John took a bride at the age of 42 in July of 1875. He married Mary Elizabeth Joseph of French Gulch. Mary was very young when they wed. It appears she was around the age of 15, while he was 42. Her father was Charles Joseph. He was French, and he emigrated in 1850 with his wife to Trinity County. In 1861, Charles was killed in a brawl at a saloon. Mary and John had a daughter, but in January of 1878, Mary and their daughter contracted scarlet fever. They both died within 2 weeks of each other. Mary was 18 years old at the time. John was devastated. Sometime later, John remarried a Carolista Davis, the daughter of an Ohio printer. She was born and raised in the mining town. She was beautiful and had gorgeous red hair with a wild and fearless nature. Apparently, her father, Josiah Patrick Davis, was known to have shot Carolista's first bow. When John and Carolista came together, she was already married to a man named Charles P. Summers, and they had 3 children together. He was the black sheep of his family. His family actually paid him to stay away from them. This was known as a remittance man. He was a man who had been exiled by his family, so he wouldn't ruin the family name. In 1886, Carolista took the kids and married John. John was now 53 years old, and they had 2 children together. They named their son after John's father, John Bentley, and their daughter, Mary Elizabeth, after the wife he lost those years before. John loved reading, and he bought several books over the years. He had quite the library, and he would lend out the books to the community. John's Madam Brown's house was destroyed by a fire in July of 1888. I'm sure the loss of the hotel was concerning to him, but he was a millionaire, and his life was going well. His enterprises were successful. He was settling into his later years, and he had a family. Life was good for John until one night, April 26th of 1890. It was rumored that Charles Summers wanted to see his children, so his ex-wife Carolista and John met him at the Woodward's Hotel in Whiskeytown. Whatever the case, John and Charles ended up in an altercation. John struck Summers with a grubbing hoe, and Summers retaliated by shooting John in the back, which proved to be fatal. Summers turned himself in, and this was also noted in the local newspaper. He was now being tried for murder. John was only 57 years old when he died. No one in his family actually found out where he was buried. Carolista was happy with John, but she went on to remarry. Her name became Carolista Cummings, and her 3 oldest children, whose father was Charles Summers, took the name Cummings as well, while the 2 children she had with John remained Harrisons. John's son, John Bentley Harrison, was raised in Greater Grizzly Gulch, Redding, and the Shasta area. He went on to have a family of his own. John William Harrison's daughter, Mary Elizabeth, died in the 1920s from stomach ailments, and she never had children. Gerald Harrison, the great-grandson of John William Harrison, wrote an article. The article was called John William Harrison of Grizzly Gulch. Mining communities were frequently referred to as gulches, because these narrow valleys and ravines were usually the locations of a collection of minerals, including gold. Streams of water typically ran through the gulches, creating natural pathways through the rugged terrain. The streams carried mineral deposits into the gulches, and water was usually found in these valleys, which were vital for placer mining for sifting through sediment. So miners would set up camps nearby. So a gulch became a generic name used for the mining areas. The reason I bring this up is I found so many gulches out and around Whiskeytown. I don't know how many were in the location of the lake, but around the outskirts of the lake, I found 20 to 30 of them, and I'll name a few. And I'm sure there's more. Here's a little trivia for you. In 1853, a hotel was built, and it was called Mix's Franklin House. Then in 1855, it became Mix's Hotel. In 1860, it became the Mix Hotel. Stay with me, this is going somewhere. And in 1870, Whiskey Creek Hotel. And then in 1873, Whiskeytown Hotel. And then in 1881, Woodward's Hotel. This is where John died. The hotel was a large, well-furnished, and popular hotel. It had a saloon and a dance hall. It burned down in 1858, but friends and neighbors helped the owner, Benjamin Mix, rebuild the hotel across the road. The hotel was demolished right before the creation of Whiskeytown Lake. The first post office was actually located inside the hotel. 4th of July celebrations and balls were held there. Varieties of meats, fruits, and a stocked bar were always available. There was a corral with barley and hay for the horses, and every kind of liquor at the time. The community really pulled together when Benjamin Mix lost his hotel. It shows you how well liked he was. I love the history of these old towns. This is just one story of one community and a few people who live there. Thanks for watching and have a good day. Bye-bye.